Record.
Okay.
Let's go ahead and begin with a word of prayer. We do thank you, our God, for the days of May as spring comes on and the world is opening up. And we pray that as we continue to press through this work of T.F. Torrance's, that there would be an opening as well, that all those things that are about who you are and what is to be disclosed and discovered, and the joy that comes from it as we move away from collapsing into human thought and discovering the delight of who you are as you give yourself to us. May these things impress upon us, reform our minds in the ways that you intend to. We pray that you do this in your name, you who is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen.
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 Well, today we are finishing chapter 5 in Theological Science with the ever engaging Travis, who he keeps denying my titles for him, so we keep coming up with new ones.
Great.
Uh,
You had a lot of me recently because I grasped at all of these in chapters 4 and 5. I let Paul have one, and then I've done the rest of those, and I'll back off for a little bit.
No, you're going to be good, and just so you know up front, and I'll say this at the end also, I'll be gone for the next 4 weeks, starting in Iceland and then landing in Sweden, Albania, Poland, Germany. I'll visit a friend there, a Bart friend there, who studied with Tom Noble, and then Denmark and on to Norway and then home. So anyway, I will be gone for a while, so we'll have a bit of a break from the reading group. But when we come back, we'll have 2 weeks with Carrie Magruder, starting in chapter 6. So that's a great way to re-engage there. Bill Ford has asked the question about whether when we're done this book, the reading group would stop. And it's like, as long as there are books on my shelf behind me we haven't read. So the next one I'm looking at doing is Karl Barth, Biblical and Evangelical Theologian. So it's helpful to me as well as I think to the group to recognize the importance of Barth for Torrance. So we'll go through that book as well.
Have we done transformation and convergence yet? Did I miss that?
No.
I don't think we have.
Okay, I was going to claim half of those too.
Yeah. So now you're throwing that out. I do attempt to go back and forth between a theologically oriented one and a science oriented one. So you'd like that one next after Bart?
Sure.
Okay.
Well, that'd be great. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Well, I will work on getting that broken out into appropriate page numbers. This reading has felt good that we're taking amounts where sometimes a chapter is too much, and particularly in this book, a chapter just seems too much. So,
well,
I would rather go slower. Go ahead.
Yeah. Transformation and convergence. The first 3 chapters are gigantic, and then they get to be much more manageable as it goes on.
Right. So I'm just exercising the right to make things readable and understandable, and more able to capture the thoughts as they progress instead of getting overwhelmed going, is this the deep end of the pool? Because I don't see the bottom even down there. So anyway, that is the future that is coming. And it'll still be into the summer before we finish this book. So today we finish with pages 263 to 280 of Theological Science. The section title, this is section 3 of this, Logical Formalization in Theological Thinking. And so, Travis, you're going to maybe just quickly orient us to what the other 2 sections have said that set up to this, and then dive in.
Yeah. So the first 2 sections were really, in many ways, a follow-up of 2 sections in chapter 4. So chapter 4 talked about the truth of God, the truth of human beings or of man, and then he talks about existence statements and coherent statements. Am I doing this right?
Not good so far.
Something like that. Anyway, there's something along those lines in there. And then so here we had the logic of all right. So the big section 1 was the logic of God, and Paul Mullner talked about that. And then now we're in part 2, which is the logic of man, and then subsection 1 of that was the logic of existence statements, and that was talking about the idea of our statements that have an overtly outward reference beyond themselves, beyond language to existing realities, and what is the logic of that kind of reference. And how do our statements refer to reality and all the rest. Part two was the logic of coherent statements. And so the idea at that point was looking less at how do individual statements refer beyond themselves, but one, how do statements refer to each other to make ideally a coherent framework? And then how does the framework as a whole connect with reality? We spent a fair amount of time last week talking about the implications of Gödel's incompleteness theorem, the quest for a logical system that is both complete and consistent, and its ultimate failure, and those kinds of things. And so we really spent a lot of time last week, and this is for setting up the first part of this chunk here, that a lot of section 2 was dealing with like really, really strict, rigid logic, which is the kind of thing where there's a sense of logic that we use in our everyday conversation, but this is a level beyond that, where it's this idea of we're trying to reduce the kinds of legitimate inferential moves you can make in logic to symbols. So you can kind of because it's one of those things where if you know one statement is true, you can conclude a variety of things from specifications if you've reduced it to symbolic form. And it is both outrageously powerful and also dangerous, because you have taken a step away from actual concrete actuality in order to do that. And there are going to be some fields for which that is good and right and appropriate and fine. But there's always a danger that we've missed something in our formalization, and therefore we might end up flattening out reality into a timeless and spaceless connection. Because a logical connection is not the same thing as a temporal connection. Logic, there isn't before and after, there just is. And so in many ways, that kind of background, that it was, Torrance clearly wants to talk about the major advances in logic, as well as its ultimate defeat as far as trying to achieve that complete and consistent system. And he wants to acknowledge the power of logic and orderliness in our thinking, and crucially, the importance of our statements do need to make some kind of sense in themselves. But they're not going to make total sense if they remain enclosed within themselves. And in many ways, this very beginning here, he says, this is at the very, very beginning of the section. He says, so far as theology is concerned, it must be admitted that logical and mathematical formalization is not a relevant form of accuracy, as we can see in the grave doubts of faith over the stringent applications of logical precision to religious experience. Nevertheless, theological science, like any other science, cannot do without verbal and logical machinery, if only in the interest of methodological habits and tidy thoughts. So he's trying to say here, it seems that he's saying we cannot do without logic in the general sense, but we also need to be clear about the fact that basic Christian experience, religious experience, is more complicated than we're going to be able to effectively reduce to that symbolic logic. So we need to be aware of both its pros and its cons, which he's been hinting at throughout. But that's the very first thing he says when applying these logical tools of our language to theology. We must always, always, always be careful about what they can do and what they can't do.
Is that a kind of humility? I mean, is it we need to be humble?
Yeah, I think so. But it's, I really is cataphysic. Again, of course, you understand. For me, cataphysics everything. That was actually before I published the dissertation. That was the main title of the dissertation. As it was presented, and it's the idea of treating things as they actually are. Well, if religious experience, just to use the example he explicitly mentions here, is of the kind of thing that cannot be flattened into symbolic notation without distorting it, then the one thing we must not do is try to do that. So it's once again, it's treating it the way it needs to be treated. So so it is a certain amount of humility. It's humility in the sense that we always need to be humble before whatever it is we're investigating.
Okay. Young got something for
I think it's also exhibiting the tension that on the one hand, as human beings, the way we know anything, the way we systematize knowledge requires us to do symbolic representation at some logical rendition at some point. But it always needs to be tentative, that it can always be modified. It needs to be open to new concepts and to be introduced. So it's never final in that sense. But we still have to endeavor to do it, right? Otherwise, we wouldn't have a systematic kind of an understanding. It would just be kind of hodgepodge. So,
well, and it's also, to a certain degree, it's also bearing witness. We want our theological perspective to make sense and be logically coherent, because we're talking about a God who is not incoherent. if God actually does have coherence in God's own self, then our story, our message about God must also be coherent. Now, Torrance will also talk about the important thing is we need to also be careful we don't become satisfied with a coherence of our own making. It needs to finally have its coherence in the coherence of God. And he talks about that in a variety of different ways. But it's one of those things where it's like you can have the greatest system in the world, but if it doesn't actually correlate with reality, then it's not helpful. And I use that word correlate on purpose because he does talk about empirical correlates in some of his later writings. So that's trying to connect things together.
Some people would say God is incoherent. So, I mean, there is
Well, they're wrong. I mean, Torrance would
just
say they're wrong.
That's why we're doing theological science, is because people would say, I don't believe in imaginary friends and things like that. God is incoherent to me. So
in the words of those great British philosophers, I don't believe in Peter Pan, Frankenstein, or Superman. All I want to do is ride my bicycle. Sorry.
There you go. The idea of verbal and logical machinery, that phrase that he uses there in this first section, the nature of machinery to say, Jesus loves me, this I know. We don't want it to be verbal or logical machinery, but neither is it numerical or mathematical. And so part of the nature of the question of how do we replace the word machinery so that there's something that is verbal and logical, but does not become mechanical, that has katafusen appropriate to the nature of the investigation in which we're engaging. So for Barth's overarching God speaks, we can't use machinery to get at God speaking.
Well, hang on. He says we cannot do without this machinery.
I know. And I'm saying Jesus loves me, this I know. The word machinery seems a little bit of a problematic word because it seems to be an impersonal metaphor to engage something that is a personal engagement.
Right, so but he is specifically talking about like grammar and the way our language interacts, why our statements interact with each other. I mean, so he's talking about something, which is precisely why he's warning us, though, because you're right that what you're talking about and making it impersonal is absolutely the danger. But right. I think it's one of those things where it's like I think what he's trying to get us to say is, or at least one way of applying this would be, and it would be tempting because that's such a real danger to throw up our hands and say, well, we're not gonna worry about coherence at all. We're not gonna worry about how our statements relate to each other at all. We're just gonna make simple declarative statements about what is, and we don't care whether it hangs together or not. Well, the problem, of course, is then there's a danger there as well, because it also becomes very easy to manipulate.
Right. So
you could also use Marty, maybe you could also use the analogy, that you can see someone play a beautiful piece of Beethoven on the piano, but, from the way the person plays the piano, you can tell it's just mechanical. It's just something learned. But when you hear someone who actually can translate those notes into emotion and feeling, that is something entirely non-mechanical.
Right. Right. And I love that word feeling in there, just opening up the avenue of how does the person enter in, so that the particularity of each musician does bring in something that is unique artistic kind of dimension. On 279, which is, almost at the very end, he says, this is why theological knowledge comes through hearing and is constructed on the basis of the word, is not easy for those who find themselves thinking only in pictorial images and plastic ideas, which, the nature of the reduction of this to not hearing in the way that you just described, hearing a musician, there is something that is unique about the character that our mechanistic logic can become a block. And so the whole nature of how he's dealing with that and plastic ideas, I mean, that's again the mechanical. And for many people, they know how to read the words on the page, but I think he's the one that talks about the first level, second level, third level, fourth level. Many people, all they can get is there are words on the page, and I say, yes, I believe those. Well, what do you think they mean? I have no idea, but I can say them on the morning when we say the creed. I can say the words, it's like, okay, well, that's doesn't have the dimension of what it is that I think that he's aiming for with this verbal and logical. So I'm looking for just a nature of how verbal and logical maintain a cataphuzin that is appropriate to the nature of persons and not merely to the nature of the biological or physical world, how we make that distinction. So I'm still searching for how to distinguish an appropriateness of cataphuzin that has verbal and logical um, clarity, or there's something that I'm looking for there, because when you speak
Mhm.
to somebody and you feel like I understand what you're saying, thank you for that word, thank you for the illustration you gave. Clarity rather than machinery says that there's something about the dynamic of the knowing in the process of the communication that has achieved something that maybe is what Katafusan looks like.
Well, I mean, it seems important that Torrance will emphasize the idea of word, like you said, word, and
Yeah,
part of that's because a word comes from a person. You know,
yeah,
um, by the way, it's interesting. I don't know if anybody else has ever had any experience with trying to edit um, pictures and video versus editing audio, and it's very different. If you have like a spot in a picture, you can do a million things to cover it up or to adjust it. It is very
mm,
hard. Like you have like if someone interrupts a recording or you want to remove this extra thing, and they say they're doing it now with AI. I don't know about that, but like it is so much harder to edit something out of audio if
mm.
it's in it to start with. You can so it's just fascinating that there's also that it is easier to falsify what we see than just what we hear as well. I think at least that's been my experience. But
Yeah,
I think
that's a
but
great statement.
Jesus being the Word made flesh.
Yeah,
I think there's a sense in which we're kind of just saying that that verbal has a way of being keyed into the very being of God in a way that image cannot. That it's precisely actually because of this deep Hebraic conviction that you cannot represent God in an image. You can only listen to
right.
hear from God, and also I mean it's important to realize that also that of logos and lalia is a very very personal way of interacting with one another. And
Yeah,
again, I think this idea of I feel like you might be still kind of hesitating at that idea of logical machinery, but and I appreciate the fact that that language can evoke a very impersonal thing, but I really do think that Torrance is trying to get this idea of when he says logic. I think you could just easily substitute in an inherent rationality, that it fits together. Everything is of a piece. That we're not
okay.
it's not two halves at war with each other, for example.
Yeah,
And so this idea of that the reason why our words referring to Jesus in this case have to make some kind of logical sense, even if it's a logic that is referring out to Jesus to get that logic, is because
yeah,
Jesus does make sense. Um, and the only way we can have cataphysic knowledge of Jesus is if our language comes more and more to resemble the kind of order that we have in Jesus. So, for example, if we turn the page to 264, well, I guess here, let's finishing at the bottom here. So, right after Tidy Thought says, moreover, at the ground level, even in the knowledge of faith, theology works with the principle of reliability, similar to that with which we work in our ordinary natural logic when we presuppose that in the real world around us, things fit together in the same sort of way as our thoughts do. There is a systematic connection in the nature of things, a regularity upon which we can rely, but makes it possible to live a planned and rational life. And so we try to say that our whole point in language across the board, including talking about God, is we want the relationship between our ideas as expressed in our language to more and more resemble the actual connections that take place in actual things. Now, of course, the problem is that then you might say, well, hang on a second, we might make a mistake. But the very next thing he says here is, but then from time to time, we are jerked out of our assumptions by experiences which reveal a discrepancy between our customary forms of thought and what actually happens in the world. We're forced to reflect upon things at a deeper level, for we have evidently been working with too superficial a view of uniformity and have clamped down abortively, as it were, upon nature a form of unity which it rejects. So it's this idea of allowing reality to stand in judgment over our conceptions of it, that we're not asking, we're not asking what, we're asking what kind, we're asking the qualis est, not quadsit or quidsit. I don't know. I didn't take Latin. And this idea of it is precisely because of this sense that, in this case, Jesus objects to us and consistently and is who he is, that continues to challenge our theoretical constructions of it. If we were in the philosophy of science, we would talk about conjectures and refutations as one way of trying to deal with a similar issue here, which is you put a conjecture out there and then it breaks itself against reality, so we come up with a new one. I think that Popper is a bit superficial, but that's at least one way of trying to get at a similar idea.
So in the statement, it's that I've been crucified with Christ. It's no longer I live, but Christ lives in me. The life I now live, I live by the faithfulness or faith in. So there's a formal statement that can go one way or the other. And so Torrance is saying we need to make sure that the logic of the form of our interpretation is true to the nature of the speaker. What is Jesus meaning? Is it our faith or his faith? And so we're doing something that is logical. We're asking grammatical questions, objective or subjective, genitive. So the word machinery, I can see somewhat apply there. And we're wanting to make sure that it's attuned to what Jesus himself is saying and doing. So that's where our logic is attempting to get clarified. And if you get it wrong, you have a whole nother system of Christianity, in a sense, just based on that one word. I mean, it's that important.
Yeah. So here's background that I didn't put in the handout that is occurring to me might be helpful. So the class, so there's you'll find all kinds of discussions of these of the idea of a correspondence theory of truth. One of the classic examples is that the grass is green. Only works if there is grass and there is a color called green and the grass is that color. Everything corresponds to reality. Well, one of the things that's kind of that's how you could argue that's the classic view. And so one of these has become kind of a sign of postmodernity is this idea of it's not so much, how in the world can we know for sure if everything corresponds? Maybe not everything's going to correspond. The question is, do we have a coherent worldview? This is where I think Wittgenstein gets lumped in with the relativists and all the rest. And so at that point, so the priority of the first one is it must refer to reality, period. The second one was we're not so worried about whether it refers to reality or not. What we want is intelligibility. One of the things we get with Torrance is we get the sense where, so for example, in the philosophy of science, you have, some of the realists will say the goal is to get our theories to tell a literally true story of what the world is like. And it's fascinating because if you read Torrance carefully, you realize he's not actually advocating for that. It would be nice if that happened. And, if the day were to come and we finally have an absolutely adequate scientific theory, it would correspond in that way. But the point is not necessarily that it needs to correspond to every particular in order for it to be correct. And it's also not the case that coherence is enough. It does still need to, at some point, go as a whole, needs to still press into reality. And so, and he will talk about it in other writings by talking about how we need to have empirical correlates. So, for example, we have this general picture of the gospel, as being something like a theological scientific theory about what happens to Jesus and what does it mean and all the rest. And at some point, because neither you nor I can directly experience the resurrection, we still have to raise the question of, does this actually connect up with the world that we live in and experience or not? And one of the points is one of the empirical correlates of that is the empty tomb. That it's one of those things where it's like when Einstein had his theory of relativity, one of the things it meant was that gravity bends light. And so the idea was if we were to have known locations of stars, they would look like they're in a different place during an eclipse than where we would otherwise observe them to be. And so one of the things he was saying is one of the implications of my theory is that if we check when there's an eclipse, we should be able to see that the light is bending around the sun. Normally we couldn't see it because the light's too bright. And it's one of the most famous examples of predicting in advance the implications of your theory and then being able to test it directly. In fact, it's such a profound example of that I think it bewildered a whole generation of philosophers. I think that's the best way, that's the only way to do things. Which is I think why, I don't think Popper's view would have gotten quite so much oxygen if it hadn't been for that. But the point being that if our theories don't actually have any implications that we can actually look at and actually encounter, then what's the difference between that and just a totally fabricated fantasy? And so for Torrance, it's very, very important that no matter how careful we construct things, no matter how minutely we've worked out the details, it does still actually need to refer beyond itself to creation or to the actual reality that we're trying to study. Because if it doesn't, then all it is an idea. It is as applicable as strict Euclidean geometry, which is only kind of and not even really.
Maybe. I mean, he is going to talk about parables and so forth. So
Mhm.
a friend of mine in New Zealand was doing a PhD on language and metaphor, and she used to use the word green. The phrase "pink is green." Have you ever heard this before?
No, but I'm assuming it's referring to ecological stuff.
It is. It is.
Yeah,
So the pink is the what you put into your attic to insulate the house, which is
sure.
green. So now we're saying that the nature of metaphor, which parables depend upon, require us to be attentive to the realm within which they are speaking what they're trying to bring. So there is a sense in which his discussion here, when he gets to parables, is to say we have to adjust our language to fit the nature of the intent of a person within
Sure.
a field of thought that portrays something that is also true, and not just dismiss it because it's just a parable or something like that. So again, this is part of
Mhm.
the language game, so to speak.
Well, and that's
Still,
what I suggested a few weeks ago that the phrase, the statement "God exists," could be false depending on what someone means by that. You know, because I can say God exists, and I of course I believe it's true. But if somebody who has a fundamentally different understanding of what that word God means,
right?
then I would say that it is false.
Yeah,
Um, and this was one of the things where
Also, the
that's
word exist.
right.
It could mean in the physical, material sense, in which
right.
case God is
Right.
not that way. So,
Not
yeah.
that
Right.
way. Yeah.
Well, there's a great passage in Wittgenstein's Philosophical Investigations. I got to bring that up again here too, where he talks about Moses. What do we mean by Moses? And he lists like 6 or 7 attributes. And the question is, suppose any one of those would turn out to not be true. Would I give up everything, or would I feel like maybe some of them are more important than others? Would I lean on one or lean on the other, depending on how the use takes me? And he's talking about this idea of you know um, we're not always the best. Well, I think one of the implications is where we're not always the best judge of what exactly it would take for us to give up a viewpoint. But the point is, how are we using, in this case, the word Moses, or how are we using these parables? Absolutely matters. Which is part of the reason why I know that sometimes the Bart and Wright crowds, Karl Barth and Wright don't always get along, um, but but there's something to at least the philosophical goal of digging deep into the historical context to understand what was being meant by the people at the time. Not because it's the only word that needs to be heard, but because it is a word. It is a word that needs to be heard.
Right. And understood.
Right.
And the word understand is kind of it's seeing things in their proper contexts, asking who is the agent who's speaking these terms, and are we hearing it in a way that's true to them. Now, in your first opening statements, you have a mention of Paul Molnar, and I couldn't understand quite the point was that you were
Oh,
making that. Could you?
uh, Paul Molnar does not like the way Torrance talks about geometry being related to physics being similar to natural theology to revealed theology, and
Right.
that's the only connection with Paul's comment. I was trying to say I think that part of the idea here, is this idea of we need to have a logical connection that on one level is not attached to reality, but it would then also need to apply to reality. And I was saying I imagine that there's a similar concern to having geometry relate to physics. So
Right.
I wasn't necessarily trying to open up the whole natural theology can of worms, but I think that there's a similar idea there where there is a place using geometry in physics. Is perhaps a more apt connection here. This idea of we need to be able to think rigorously through the geometry, even if we know that even while we're doing that, we still have to modify it when it applies to the actual world. In the same way, it's important for us to think through our theological statements, even though we know that even our most clear statements about God fall radically short of who God actually is.
Travis, one example of that is, for instance, George Hunsinger. He uses the word asymmetrical.
Oh,
It's
sure.
the asymmetrical, which is a geometric term that describes the relationship between God and man. That God, of course, is so much more weightier,
Mhm.
the term, than the word man. and that this is an asymmetrical relationship. I think it, describes that well.
Sure.
So also the nature of, well, if you ask Jeremy Bigby to play, Bach's Fifth Symphony in ragtime or classical or whatever, he can adjust it and play it in any style, but you clearly know what it is. It's a little bit like the day of Pentecost, where the many languages are speaking the one thing, where there is an adaptability, where what is intended to be heard, the mighty acts of God, requires an adaptation to actually be heard by those who are the hearers.
Mhm.
Right. So this is the science and the art of the theological work. Um, so I'm just becoming more attuned to the idea that science has a profound artistic dimension, and part of this saying not mechanistic is to allow to say there is an art of knowing what the speaker is saying so that the hearer can hear it in a way that's appropriately getting what's across. And that does require the attentiveness of what we would call the art of expression in a way that meets the needs of both sides of that communication process. And if you just think everybody speaks English, then when you're talking to Japanese or Chinese, then it's all going to be Greek to them.
Well, it's not you use the example of a piano. I mean, when you talk about, again, also another way maybe thinking about that word machinery. I mean, the piano is also a machine, and you must use the mechanics of the piano in order to play it.
Right.
To say, oh, you're not saying this, but suppose someone were to say, oh, I don't like the idea of having machinery. This is supposed to be art. It's supposed to be music. Let's get rid of machinery altogether. Well, then you've gotten rid of the piano because it can't function.
Like Calvin in the church. Calvin got rid of, I think, all instruments in the church. So that's Calvin.
Well, my point though is, the piano is a machine, and of course, the machine can be used in a way that's mechanistic and lifeless, or it can be used in a way that is full of art. So, I mean, that's just another example of, I think Torrance is using machinery in not in a polemic way. I think he's trying to use it in a things that work together to function.
Yeah. So I'm hearing that in this chapter, the word logic, it has a somewhat mechanistic sense, and yet it can be played in an artistic way in preaching and in writing that brings the life of the living God into nuance in the same way that Mark just described the nature of the distinction between God and the human. There is a distinction, but just say that there's different doesn't say everything needs to be said. It just opens up, allowing the conversation to continue.
Well, so I think it's important to understand then that how Torrance uses the one word logic in several different ways, and he's used them in all of the ways in this chapter. He sometimes uses it in a strict form of symbolic, rigid logic. He also uses it as just a way to say this is how things fit together, and he talks about it as the inherent intelligibility of biological things, physical things, divine, reality. He uses it in all those ways. So, it's quite possible we might want to say, perhaps he would have been clearer. I think he's using it on purpose in a multifaceted way. I think he's trying to connect those dots together. But we could, if we wanted to, say, well, when we're talking about, the logic of God, well, we'll talk about inherent intelligibility instead. We're going to talk about inner rationality or something like that, and then we're going to reserve logic to talk about the words that we use. I know that Torrance talks about truth as a category, as a postulate of being, and that makes people very uncomfortable. And yet at the same time, so I even said in my book, I said, if you would feel comfortable, just think everything that says truth of being, just think reality. But I don't think Torrance would be happy with that substitution, because I think he's trying to draw a line between those things. He's trying to make a connection that is somewhat weakened if we don't use the phrase truth of being. But if that's a hang up for somebody, I'd rather them get rid of the hang up so they can crawl inside Torrance's thinking rather than be kept off at the beginning.
Maybe he's also just referring to the person who said, I am the truth.
Right. I think, Travis is right in the sense that I think Torrance is really using the word logic and trying to expand it to more than what is used in mathematical logic. And so I think what's helpful is when he uses the word formal logic, or here, logical formalization. To me, that is when he is restricting it to the more symbolic, mechanical nature of logic, which, can be good or bad, but it's not mechanical is not necessarily bad. Mechanical helps us to do things without really thinking, right? That's the whole point of calculus, that we learn how to do like long division, where we don't have to think about it, we can just follow the rules. And that's the point of formalization, is to enable us to think bigger things so that the small things we don't have to really think about. So that's where the formalization is useful. And the word mechanical here just means that. It's like grammar. The grammar of a language, in a sense, is mechanical because you can say something is grammatical or not grammatical. And that does not detract from the poetic part of the language. So,
even though we have to break it right away, we say one God in three persons.
Right.
We
oh yeah,
immediately have to deal with, in a sense, the math of it and say, but we don't mean one and three in the same senses of what we would normally mean it. We have to begin doing our scientific investigation already just with that statement.
But even still, so what we're trying to do is we are trying in whatever way we can to make the coherence of our language map onto the inherent rationality within the being of God. Now that is notoriously difficult to do, and people from forever have said that we haven't yet ever. There are some things we know we must say because there are some things we know we must not say. But again, and Torrance gets criticized for this. But he says periodically that even the homoousion is not sacrosanct or irreformable. I think it's important, and people say, "Well, but you actually think that it is." And it's like I don't think so. I think he said if something were to come along that were to preserve everything that we think is important about that, but does it better, then I think he would be all right with it. Now, it hasn't happened for a long time. It's not likely to happen, but I think he is still open to that possibility. But, and I think this is important, I don't think we would be able to identify such a transition until we've already gone through it. It's one of those things where we only really understood the significance of Einsteinian's way of looking at things once we crossed over into it, and now we look back and we can see what sense it makes up. We have to cross that logical gap before we can really understand what we've done. So I think, but I think that's, yes. Sorry, I lost where I was going with that.
That's okay. We're with you in that lostness. It's wonderful.
I mean, I think the doctrine of the Trinity is like the epitome of that apparent contradiction, and yet we are forced to acknowledge it. And that means we understand the numbers 1 and 3 ordinarily, but then to say that God is unity, Trinity, I mean, it's kind of like putting them together, and it's up to us then to try and change our thinking so that it makes sense, right? Because we're not going to change math, we're not going to change the meaning of number, but somehow the doctrine is requiring us to change our thinking. And that's, to me, what Torrance is really trying to get at here, is that we need to step back and be like children and see things in a different way and not be wedded to our traditional thought, which then becomes contradictory in the light of the revelation.
I think I said this in my handout at some point. I think that the issue with Torrance's book, The Christian Doctrine of God, is just an absolute masterpiece, in part because he never once tries to say, gosh, how can we make 1 and 3 make sense together? He starts by saying, why do we say what we have to say? Where did this come from? And it's one of those things where, like, every time the secular world comes at Christians and says, you guys are so dumb. Don't you realize 1 can't be 3 and 3 can't be 1? This is an obvious mistake. And obviously the hostile world can't understand it. But what they don't understand is the reason why we're never going to give that up is because, yes, it's precisely in that moment, because it's not based on nothing. It's not based on an intellectual model. It's based on an actual real thing, that we realize actually the fact that our language has broken down for us is a sign that we're onto something, that we don't say that about everything. We don't just, we don't fill Christian theology with seemingly contradictory things just for fun. It's really only at this point where we feel like our language is broken down. The fact that we are so unwilling to give it up is a testament. That's like the fact that we are broken down and we have to keep saying 3, and the moment we say 3, we also have to say 1, and back and forth and do all these jumping around is precisely because we know there's something there, and we have not yet been able to articulate it in a way that is beyond misunderstanding. And
Nor,
I think the confusion of it, though, I think is bearing witness to the complexity of the reality.
on page 81 of that book, that great book, right? Christian Doctrine of God.
Okay, I don't have my copy with me.
Yeah. Thus, in a strange way, God is known by us and not being known.
Right.
Right. And he goes on and talks about what Paul called the great great mystery of godliness. There's a point beyond which we cannot go, right? I mean, that no matter how many words we want to string together, we'll never get beyond a certain point. It's Athanasius, he quotes, used to express it, thus far human knowledge goes. Here the cherubim spread the coverings of their wings.
And what makes that book such a masterpiece, though, is that because if we just stopped there and said, "Oh, it's a mystery, we can't describe it," well, then the outside world would rightly point to us and say, "Well, I don't think you're taking this very seriously." But it's not that there's nothing we can say. There's this one thing we can't say. There's a lot we can say, and I think that Torrance is just absolutely passionate unpacking of what are the biblical roots of the Trinity. Why do we say this? How does the Trinitarian, how do we shape this? How does this reveal to us how our language works together? I think all of that goes to show like there really is a there, and we're not just throwing up our hands. It may seem that way to the outside observer who has not yet been educated in why we came to this point. I think these are. I am always amazed whenever anybody speculates and says I don't see any connection between, for example, theological science and the Christian doctrine of God, because I think I'm just always amazed that they're absolutely of a piece in my perspective. They're just absolutely deeply intertwined.
It's the ordo. What is it? The ordo cognoscendi.
Yeah,
is that how you say it?
The order in which you come to know things. So that's later on my hand, I think, right? So the ordo essendi is the order in which things actually are. The order that's inherent in being. So God has always been triune. The ordo cognoscendi is, well, how do we know that God is triune? Well, we have to start with who Jesus is and what the Spirit does and all those other kinds of things. And so for us, because we have to follow the way that we know things, the Trinity is a conclusion, but for God, it's the first thing. But what I find fascinating is because he spends a lot of time trying to explain, like this is the length and breadth, the ground and grammar of how the church has always felt it had to talk about the incarnation and what does that mean. And in order to take the incarnation seriously, you're bound to conclude something like the Trinity. You might express it slightly differently depending on how history unfolds. If it hadn't unfolded in Greek and Latin, you might not have used ousia. You might have found some other way of saying it, but you're up against that basic reality.
There's something in that reality, though, just using again Bart's starting point is God speaks. And so that is the ordo essendi, is that God speaks. And so the work of our thinking has to proceed from the fact that God has spoken. So, I mean, a lot of this chapter is about our speaking. And so to say, if we don't acknowledge, first of all, God has spoken in the person of Christ, then all of our speaking at some level is going to be adrift. And if we are doing the clarifying work that Bart begins with, the Christian dogmatics is the church's scientific self-examination of its distinctive talk about God. Right? So, I mean, Torrance is living within that. But he hasn't really brought up the speaking dimension till there is something a little bit of hearing in the end of this section, but not the nature of kataphusin with speaking.
Right, but this is I haven't hammered this yet on this section, but I think it needs to be hammered again. It is vitally important to realize not just what he's saying in this section, but also where he has put it. It is crucially important that this whole thing about logic having to do with theology has come at the end, not at the beginning. He doesn't start by saying this is how we talk about logic and all the rest, and now we have to fit God into it. He starts by saying this is who God is. This is the inherent intelligibility of God. This is what it means to refer to things in our language. This is how our language works together. Here's the benefits and liabilities. And now that we've covered all those things, now we can talk about how we responsibly and appropriately relate our language to God. But you're right. So you're right. In this section, he does not talk very much about Deus Dixit, but he did, earlier in the chapter. The only problem is we're going through this actually at a fairly good clip, and it still takes us a long time from A to B. That's another reason I'm glad to take the opportunity to remind everybody that Torrance is doing exactly what his theology would say, which is you start with God and then you talk about these other things. But since we've been in this issue of our language for so many weeks now, it's so easy to lose sight of the fact that's the context. And you're right. If we lose sight of that God speaks that he talks about in section 1 of this, then you're right. We are going to distort things. We are going to misunderstand things.
Right.
Yeah, and if I may, just one more beautiful sentence from this page 81, CDC or CD Christian Doctrine.
CDG.
Yeah, thank you. While it is in his light that we see light, from the Psalm, right? While it is in his light that we see light, the very splendor of God's light finally hides him from us. The very splendor of his light finally hides him from us. In the mystery of his self-revelation, God reserves the innermost secret of his eternal being as God, into which, as Irenaeus insisted, we cannot intrude. Oh, man, I wish I'd written that.
Well, that also corresponds to Scripture, Bill. You know, when we read Colossians chapter 1, where it says he, meaning Christ, is the image of the unseen God. So even in his revelation, God is not seen, but his image is his absolute exact reflection in Christ. So those are two things we always have to keep together.
Yeah.
That is like crucial.
Yeah. And we can say that while there is a dimension of being unknown, the Spirit searches the deep things of God and knows them, and in Christ makes them available. So Yahweh revealed himself to Moses as I am. Jesus picks that up with I am the good shepherd, I am the door, I am the resurrection. And that's a further seeing into, that's a kind of a katafusin, penetrating into the mysteries of God through the language of analogy. But in context, you understand those words and they're tied to the nature of who God is, but they also there is a light that is shown upon us to understand, oh, that's who you are, and that's the context that you create for our meaningfulness in response. So mystery, as I think Torrance would agree, mystery doesn't mean can't be known.
Right.
It just
Well, I think
means that,
Mystery actually just means veiled.
but
You know,
it's not as though we can't live into the mystery. We indwell the mystery of Christ and we keep learning and seeing our whole life. And by the Spirit opens up. Do we get into the depths of the mystery of God? We don't know what that would look like, but we just know we keep learning.
That's right.
It's not a wall veil. It's an invitational. Come, the Spirit of the bride say, come and take the water of life without cost. So,
you tell us also some of this history, some of the ways that Torrance lives this out. And I think about the passages where he looks at, there's one place where he actually describes, he says, well, we need to consult the theological dictionary, which is the Septuagint. And I just find that fascinating where, he'll talk about, what the word for, atonement, what Hebrew words is it translating and all the rest. And it really makes, it's fascinating. So I have used the example with other folks and I've tried to help explain, what does Paul mean by the fullness of time? And it's like, well, let's on the one hand, we could say, well, why would God come at one time versus another time? We could always come up with reasons we wanted to. But if we start with the incarnation and then reason why was that time, helpful? Well, there are several things. One, there's a lingua franca. People know Greek. You can spread it around. There's roads in which you can do all that. There's a lot of things that are in place. There's also the Septuagint that could be read by non-Hebrew speaking folks. So I kind of always said, oh, here's this thing where God was preparing the way for that. But it hadn't occurred to me to think that is it possible that God knew that this New Testament witness was going to be written in Greek? And so therefore provided, a theological dictionary so that we don't have to speculate, I wonder what this Greek word means. Well, one of the things we can do is we can look and say, well, hang on a second, how did these translators, choose, they use these Greek terms. What did they mean in the context of the Old Testament? It's just fascinating. Yes, I remember in my New Testament exegesis classes, I felt that the number one most important tool I ever learned how to use, it wasn't dictionaries, it wasn't commentaries, it was an actual like Greek concordance. How is this word used? I always found it to be far more enlightening than anything I picked up in the other using the tools. An actual real life concordance to say it's because it's not just what does this word mean, it's how is this word used, which is always a more important question.
Yeah.
And I think that Torrance is doing that, which is another place where we had this idea of if we want to understand, our logic also has to be understood from the frame point in which it's being, used. Which means we can't just take, hey, I'm a 21st century American. How do I read the English translation of the text? It has to, which is a fine thing to do. But at some point, if we want to be precise, we have to also ask the question, how would first century, Jews and Gentiles have read this in the light of their background and all the rest? I just think it's just utterly fascinating. It just,
One example for me is the word of or the use of the word abyss, because you go back to the Septuagint in Genesis 1, and the darkness and everything there is actually described in the Septuagint as abyss. And this is also the abyss from which Jesus was raised up from the dead. That is also used in the New Testament. That's just an interesting example to me,
Yes, and we're trying to get at the language. I mean, that's what this section's about, the nature of how language is used in logical ways. The third paragraph from the bottom of your first page, the words impose and discover are all caps. So
yes.
Part of the distinction we're going here is using words to discover, and even discover doesn't get away with mystery. Discover is engaging the mystery, right? And imposing is what he doesn't want human logic to do. So there's a clarification there.
So he's actually a little more clear about his language here than he is in a couple other places. There are a couple of places where he talks about this idea of, so I had a quotation there, we presuppose that in the real world around us, things fit together in the same sort of way. I did a lot of voice to text, and I did not clearly proofread it very well. In the same sort of way as our thoughts do. I don't know why I've changed to amenities, but so there's a couple of places where he talks that way, where it almost sounds like, we make an assumption that the way we think is already the way things are. Like, I remember reading a couple times being like, is that really what he's saying? Because that seems very out of character. Now, he's a little more clear about how he uses it here. But so that's why I wanted to at least clarify in case anybody else had the same confusion reading Torrance at one point that I did. And so I have here, we must note that while Torrance will occasionally sound like he's almost hinting at a kind of Leibnizian pre-established harmony, that is, everything just is already just playing through the motions that were already ordained for it, it looks like we're having a conversation, but in fact, we are all a bunch of monads having our own little, moment that have nothing to do with each other. And I also try to make the distinction, there's a Kantian idea that, he says we've been operating as though we need to discover order. He says, well, perhaps we are actually imposing order. And so I want to be clear that when he says we presuppose the world fits together like our language does, he's not trying to say that we actually somehow create the order that's in the universe. And in fact, again, this passage is clear about the fact that we kind of assume that the world is the way we think it to be. And then when those two things rub up, then we realize we're in the wrong. So he is, again, there are other places where he's a little bit less cautious about how he articulates that. And at a casual reading, it can sound like he's doing something like Leibniz or Kant, and he's not. So I just.
Right. And was the statement cat and the statement mat and the statement sitting, was that yours or is that Torrance's?
That's mine.
That's
so
yours.
I mean, man, I really need to proofread these better when I do them, because I have not done a good job of that. Yeah. So the idea, though, so the idea is, so we say the words, the cat sat on the mat, right? And so in our brains, we have the cat that we're, if we were to say, if we said the mat sat on the cat, we'd go, well, hang on a second, something's wrong with that.
I got confused
whether the
mat was a mat or not. So.
And it could have been, but it meant to be, I was meaning mat, Okay. That's what I'm saying. I missed that, right? But but that's the thing is, right? Or let's use man for a second, because if we were to reverse it and say, the man sat on the cat, like that would go, well, that's a strange thing to see. And if reality lines up with what our statements are, well, that's a very strange, situation. The point is that the statements fit together in a world that may not have anything to do with reality. But if they do, we are anticipating that they relate in a similar way. So it's almost like we have if you have a picture in your head, or say you had a picture of a cat sitting on a mat, right? The picture cat is sitting on is picture sitting on the picture mat. And that's pointing to a state of affairs beyond itself. So I'm just trying to make a distinction between the statement
and
the statement system that may or may not be real and the reality.
Okay. So I'm going to move you down to the bottom where you talk about him dealing with the problem of evil and how he deals with that. That's your bottom paragraph of the first page.
Yeah. What did I say about that? What was I thinking?
What were you thinking? What evil was going through your mind?
Well, that's the thing. If I write these things down because it makes sense at the time, and then I'm looking at it again. Let's see. Let me just read out loud for a second. That'll probably jump from my thoughts here. So, in religious experience and treatment and knowledge, we work with the principle of the faithfulness of God, and we live and plan our lives accordingly. But we keep meeting evil and suffering, which rise up before us as manifestations of disconnection or disorder in the nature of things. And we're shocked at their deformity, i.e., their contradiction of radical form. Okay. So then, yes, I got what I was thinking. Okay. So earlier in this, he was saying, we assume the world works the way our language does, but occasionally we discover that in fact the world does not work as our language does, in which case we need to go back and think about things again. So in the same way, we think about God. Well, God is faithful and God is good and God does all kinds of nice things. And we have a picture of how the world should work if that is all the case. Well, then we experience the world and we go, oh, that is not the case. There are things that seem at least to contradict that. So we either need to go back and say, hang on a second, were our assumptions fundamentally wrong, or are there complicating factors that we need to take into consideration that we had not taken into consideration before? So he says there, and so we're driven to meditate upon them more profoundly, for even disorder argues for order, seeking to reduce our understanding of experience to fuller intelligibility. We still believe that God is reliable and faithful, and that form and order belong to the fabric of the universe, and behind creation and fall there remains God eternally and infinitely loving and wise. From a point of view of logical form, there's a grave disconnection between the goodness and power of God and the facts of evil and suffering in creation. For faith, this element of incoherence is a problem only vis-a-vis ultimate coherence. Faith insists on asking whether this is not to work with a superficial notion of uniformity. So the point is saying that there seems to be a contradiction between the reality of evil and the existence of God, but then we have to go back and say, hang on a second, if we do believe that God is of real kind of order, then we have to think about both God and evil differently than we might have if we didn't believe that. So it's once again, it's this idea of how does our language world inevitably inadequately represent the real world? How does that get changed? And then how do we have to revise things in the midst of it? So, and arguably, it's really a message of repentance as well.
And so when people look at the wrath of God, they say God must be bad, because look at what he does to people.
Right.
And so the nature of how we think about evil is because we're looking from our perspective and not indwelling what God might be doing that is around the word wrath as it appears in the Bible. So God may be standing against evil, but he appears evil, but it's because we can't see that he's saying no to that which is evil, that which is rebelled, etc. from him. Right?
Right.
So that's a point of view, so that the logic of our language requires identifying the point of view from which it makes sense. And we, at some level, have to see the agency of God informing the nature of our logical statements, or we're likely to read into them things that aren't true and then just be confused about God, because it's really just our thinking that we're confused about.
I think I've used this example recently, so it may have been last week even. There's a remarkable thing that Thomas Kuhn wrote at one point. He said he had scientific students who were reading along in like Aristotle, and all of a sudden they come to some of the scientific statements and they just said we're just ridiculously, obviously, manifestly wrong. Just crazy, and like, how could this guy who was so clearly intelligent in so many ways make just ridiculous statements? And Kuhn said he instructed them. He says, whenever you find, an otherwise incomprehensible section in an otherwise intelligent writer, that you need to figure out how it makes sense together. And once you figured out how it makes sense, then go back and read it all again, and you're going to probably see it from a different perspective. And I think that was such a beautiful depiction of something like what Torrance is getting at here. I'm not trying to equate Torrance and Kuhn, but I just thought it was a fascinating insight where it's like, we're going along our business. Everything's making sense. Everything's making sense. Something doesn't make any sense at all. Why in the world would God tell Abraham to go sacrifice his son Isaac? Doesn't make any sense, especially because for the rest of the Old Testament, he keeps saying things like, it never even entered my mind to ask you for child sacrifice. It's baffling. It's incomprehensible until we dig into it and we realize, oh, God's doing a whole bunch of stuff there. He's setting up the temple. He's setting up this idea of substitutionary atonement. He's also, in many ways, saying, hey, you're in a pagan culture. I'm going to rewrite your pagan perspective in a new way. I have lots of feelings about Genesis 22, but I love it. It's great. But yes, this idea of, what I think Torrance has this great, appropriate, wide-eyed optimism where it's almost like it doesn't matter at our first step, because our first step is not our last step. It doesn't matter how wrong we are at first, because being wrong also teaches us something. Our wrongness butts up against God's rightness, and we try it again, and we've learned something in the midst of it. And we're probably going to get that one wrong too. We're going to butt up against it again. And we're going to keep doing it over and over and over again as we continue to hammer it out. And as long as the wrongness is not the final thing we do, then great. And there's something beautiful about that. And to say, this is, of course, it's a worthwhile endeavor, because even no matter how wrong you are, it's only a problem if you stop learning from it. I think it's beautiful.
Does this tie into your section on page 2 where you say Torrance then discusses the role of logic as a way to prune our statements? The nature of pruning statements sounds like what you were talking about, the need to go keep correcting and correcting.
Yeah, sure. I mean, because right? So like, oh, here's some idea that I have. And so the point is, ideas can sound fine in isolation until you actually start playing it out. And then all of a sudden you realize, oh, if I take that premise really seriously, then I've been led down the road and I have these. So it's like a proof by contradiction kind of thing. It has led me in a place that I know I cannot go in light of the gospel. And so I have to prune back some of the statements. So it can do some of the work for us. And it helps to see, how many times have we in our lives had a thought that you go, this kind of sounds like it's a good idea. And then you heard somebody else talk about the implications and you go, oh, no, I shouldn't do that. That's bad. I'm blanking on any examples of it, but I know I've had that kind of experience before. I've had times where I lament actually our entirely online public world, because I know that I used to have conversations with people and I would give voice to what I was thinking, knowing that if I was crazy, it wasn't going to come back and bite me later on. And I've had times where things I have said out loud as an argument that I at least thought I believed, a couple of years later, I hear somebody else say the same thing. And I go, oh, I didn't realize that's how it sounded. Oh, no. I better not say that anymore, because I do not believe that. Maybe I'm alone with that, but that's been my experience a lot of times.
Well, at least you say things here, and you may try and come back and edit them, but the audio, I understand, is really hard to edit, so that will be hard.
Right. So I mean, that's the thing is, what I can do is I can take stuff out and I can substitute things in. But what I'm saying is, when we're talking over each other, it's hard for me to separate out what any one person is doing.
Yeah. Yes. So on page 267, we go to the works of John Wisdom, who I know nothing about. Do you know?
Neither do I, but he mentions him, and so therefore it orients you to what I'm talking about.
He's got a great last name. I mean, let's just listen to Wisdom here, okay?
Yeah.
I've got this kid in my class, and he's just all about wisdom. They could have named him Solomon Wisdom, and that would have been even funnier yet. So the nature of the point that Wisdom is making, though, is.
Oh yeah, right. Okay, that's How does he phrase this? This is true. So he says, the pure logician, he says, is not concerned with whether or how far a religious, moral, physical, or psychological statement is true, but with how one would know the truth of one of these statements given another of the same type. So the whole point of, again, it's not, logic doesn't actually tell you truth or falsity. You have to put something in. You have to give the system an assessment of whether something's true or false, and it can work with that. And it's like, if we already know statement P is true, then we can draw conclusions from that. But logic can never tell us whether P is actually true as such. So that's the point, though, is that again, it's one of those things where the nature of logic is, because again, I think part of this is because logic has been weaponized at various points over the years. So I think Torrance is trying to say, if we let logic be what it is, and we don't let it expand outside of where it belongs, it's actually a very good tool. Because we're realizing that if someone says, well, logic says X must be true, it's like, no. The only way we can say that is if you've already accepted something else. And if you can't name what that something else is, then you have assumptions that need to be examined, So it's one of those things where it's like, so yeah, logic says, once we tell our logical system, this is very simple, that Jesus is God in flesh, well, then we can conclude a lot of things to be true because, if he's God in flesh and he says these things, they have these implications. But, logic can connect those ideas together. Logic can tell us, if you accept this premise to be true, then it kind of binds you to affirm these other things as true. But logic itself can never tell you what initial premises to accept.
Okay.
So it's the validity of the statement.
Right. It's the validity of the connections between ideas. So that's what it says. It's not concerned with telling you whether anything is true or false. It's saying, if this is true, then here are the implications for it. Which is one of those things that, again, for me, I only have an undergraduate degree in mathematics, but even just with that, like that is an intuitively obvious point to me, but I'm realizing that it's not necessarily intuitively obvious to everyone, because, oh my goodness, in pure math exercises, you're constantly, you do not care what's actually true. You start by saying, if you have a theorem that lets you say, hey, we know something meets this criteria, so great, let X be that thing, and then you just operate on it, and it doesn't really matter. You never so that's the amazing thing. We can prove, this is actually a pretty basic proof, like in number theory. You can prove that there's an infinite number of prime numbers, and you would think you wouldn't be able to prove that because you'd think you'd have to be able to show them. Well, we can't do that. We just always know there's going to be another one, and that's because of the nature of how the logic works. It can't tell you in advance whether any particular number is true, but we can tell you with absolute certainty that there's an infinite number of them. And again, as with some of the math background, I go, yeah, that makes sense. But I can also understand how someone could say, hang on, you're telling me there's an infinite number of them, but you can't tell me which ones they are? Like, right. It doesn't bother me at all. But I can appreciate that is not necessarily an intuitive way to think for everybody.
So your last sentence on the bottom of 2, Torrance does not use this term here, but we will see in his later writings the importance of not thinking statements, but thinking reality through statements. Can you just give an example to clarify that?
He uses it. I think the clearest place he uses it is at the beginning of a chapter in Christian Doctrine of God. The point is, his concern is he always wants us to remember. So this is me. This is me paraphrasing, kind of reconstructing what Imre Lakatos calls a rational reconstruction. This is what I think he's talking about. We are always, all the time, operating with language and with reality. We are always having systems that are interacting with reality. We're always having systems that interact with reality. We don't always remember consciously that our statements are different from reality. We kind of flow back and forth, because for most things in most of our lives, our language really does map to reality. We don't, that there really is there's not necessarily any meaningful difference between our language and reality, but there's no friction between them. They just kind of, they couple, they move on, do all the rest. What Torrance is trying to draw attention to the fact that every time we do that, every time I say, hey, follow that car, like there's been a lot of interaction between my language and reality. And I don't have to think about it because we all just do it. But the problem is, if we don't examine that, if we don't keep that in mind, we can easily think, well, here's where my language leads me. I don't have to look at reality anymore. I don't have to do the science. I've already got, I've done the thought experiment. Like, well, again, thought experiments are the same idea with the logic where, thought experiments are not actually trying to tell you what is true. They're trying to say, if this thing is true, what happens? It's all counterfactual. So this idea, I think the idea we're thinking, don't think that God is captured in the reality of the statement, God is 3 and God is 1. Don't think that because you've mastered the grammar of the word Trinity, you have encountered God. You need to think, that it's not about. This is not my story to tell, but I don't know the people who are involved, so I can't ruin any confidences. Elmer tells the story in our classes, and he was talking about an early experience he had where there were two theologians, and one of them was commenting to the other. They said, I went to a prestigious PhD program. I wrote on these great topics. And they looked at the person. They said, the difference is I am an expert at manipulating the symbols of the faith, but you experience the reality and I do not. Which I think, he shares the story as being a remarkably honest conversation you always get about academic theologians. I have no idea who these people are, but I think that it gets at this idea of, we can manipulate the symbols of the faith all day long. And we can do it in a way that is orthodox in a sense, but we've forgotten that we're not talking about statements. We're talking about reality. And if we forget that, then we are always going to think that the point is getting the verbal language just right. We're going to check our boxes of, we got the catechism memorized, and that's the same thing as being a Christian. Of course it's not. Of course, I'm a Methodist, which is part of the pietistic, the pietistic background where, you gotta live it, or it's not real. We don't have a corner in the market of that. It's just it's a prevailing interest.
So the second paragraph on the top of page 3 of your handout, he then comments on the historical inaccuracy of our thinking and examples. We need to be thinking 3 and 4 dimensionality. Well, I want you to explain that, but the church has frequently learned a 2 or even 1 dimensional thinking, and the 1 is the ink on the page. Is that tying to the next paragraph with there are 3 levels there? So what 3 and 4 was? I wasn't sure how the 2 paragraphs were.
I really, it's been kind of a week. So I really didn't have any time to proofread this. So I have strangeness all over this handout. So if anybody can get any sense out of it, more power to you.
It gives rise to questions, so that's an important piece. So
so the example he's using here, he says, to take a geometrical analogy, this is 3/4 of the way down the page on 270. It's not simply a transition from plane to solid geometry we need to affect in the focus of our apprehension, but a transition to 4-dimensional geometry of space and time. In theology, however, we have never constructed a cognitive tool of this subtlety and usefulness, but have traditionally relied on formal logic. With the result, when we apply it to our thought, we find that our concepts become dehistoricized and dematerialized. So one of the things we'll talk about is that one of these Kierkegaard kind of injected back into Hegel and all the rest is that this idea of we have to take time into account. Things happen. And so he's thinking, and using the 4th dimension in a way that other philosophers haven't necessarily done that. It's also important to realize that, again, logic cannot take time into account, not by itself anyway. And maybe there's someone who's done something with it that I don't know about. And so what Torrance is trying to talk about is that here we have, Einstein, among other folks, in kind of this modern scientific situation where we're dealing with a theory that takes space, 3 dimensions of space and time into account as it goes, whereas we tend in the church to think of we have the Bible as a text that we have for us. We have to interpret the text. And we do need to read the text, and we do need to interpret the text. And nothing that we do is going to get us off the hook of that. But at the same time, if I have read the ink on the page, and I have made logically valid inferences from the ink on the page, I still have not encountered, God through the power of the Holy Spirit. Mm-hmm. And so I think what Torrance is trying to say here is this is how I'm interpreting him. I think he's saying something along the lines of, in our desire to be respectable in the world of philosophy, in the world of logic, in the educated, in order to appeal to the culture despisers of religion, we have said, look, we can do logic too. Look, we can manipulate these things too. Look, we can draw conclusions too. And allowing the only problem though is, again, what that's doing is precisely what, Marty, you have brought up several times already today, we must not do, which is start with logic and then try to shove God into this logical system.
Okay. Right after that, it says we require something like a logic of verbs.
Right.
Well, you want to speak to that? Logic of verbs?
I don't know for sure. I mean, so he has a logical instrument of a unique kind that will enable us to formalize our levels of reference without mutilating or destroying the essential forms of our thought and without flattening out our statements each time, such a way that their ontology is damaged. I'm not totally sure exactly what he means by a logic of verbs. He does say that once or twice. I don't know if I'm trying to remember if he says it elsewhere. Um,
Well,
but
one of his phrases has always been person and work of
mm,
Jesus Christ. So it's not, that you cannot divide those. So his person and his work are one. And if you want to say actions instead of works, that's maybe a synonym. So his person and actions cannot be separated.
The
yeah, well,
nature
and
of
that's the
I
thing.
think
And again, it's like cataphysic instigation where it's like he's not just deciding he needs to include the actions of Jesus. He's saying we cannot understand who he is if we only look at the person and don't look at the works. Yeah.
the nature of
also,
verbs is that there's a movement that has if it's a person doing it, there a verb is a descriptor of an action that is moved by a person. And so the logic of verbs is to understand the will of God that informs the nature of God's acts and God's words. So the verb gets us into God's intentionality in his interaction with creation, with humanity, and all that. So that is just a possibility of what he's meaning.
Verb,
yeah,
right? With a V.
The V.
yeah,
Yes.
yeah. I also, what I
It's a
get out of this when he's trying to say logical verbs is that traditionally logic has been, as Travis said, kind of static, right? It's trying to describe the current situation like a snapshot of a photograph of a world. And he's saying we need to go into a four-dimensional, as in we need to add time to it, that we need to think about things that are happening in time, in history, in a life, and that requires a richer logic than just, it is raining. No, it was raining yesterday, it's raining now, it will stop raining tomorrow. That kind of, sense of time is an inherent part of what the theological, I think, formulation should have. I think that's what he's trying to get here with the logic of verb, as opposed to logic of nouns, which is, an apple. That's it, right? But
Mhm.
instead, you're talking about eating the apple, which is inherently dynamic. And
dynamic.
yeah,
Well,
and
and
it's the nature of it, I guess, right? It needs to be living, not
right.
just
Well, and that's so I haven't invoked Laplace yet today. I did before. So this guy Laplace, he had this idea where basically if we could know in a snapshot in time, one isolated moment, every mass, every location, and every momentum of every particle in the universe, we could, without having to look, without having to investigate anything, we could predict anything that would ever happen ever again, and we could retrodict everything that ever had happened. Because all that matters is location, mass, and momentum. And that's it. And you can get all that in a snapshot in time. So again, but that's exactly precisely what what Torrance is saying we must not do, which is saying we're starting with this notion that everything already contains everything there is to know without any reference to external reality, without any reference to time. Everything is just, it just is. It's Parmenides over Heraclitus again. This idea of everything just is. Nothing really changes. Nothing really happens. Yeah, it unfolds, but it's not. But all of that unfolding was already inherent in what it was. And so it's one of those things where, again, we don't talk about Laplace in this kind of view anymore. But when Torrance was writing this, it was another 70 years closer than it is now. And so it would have still been. It might not be being taught that way anymore because he lived in a post-Einsteinian world, but he probably would have met people who were trained in that world. Yeah.
I
also,
wonder.
even though in physics things have evolved, so that from a deterministic, Newtonian mechanics, which is Laplace's thing, to a non-deterministic, more probabilistic quantum. But I think what Torrance is getting at is that philosophically, the philosophers have not caught up with that yet. They are still in the deterministic Newtonian world, way of thinking and doing logic. And I think that's what he's addressing here as well. Even though physics moved on and modern physics is nothing like the world that Laplace is describing, logicians and their theory of knowledge is still using that framework, that everything is static, that if you could have formalized some axioms, then the laws of inference would explain all knowledge. And I think that is what Torrance is saying. No, you can't that is not possible in logic either.
It's fascinating. So I'm going to bring this back to you, Young. You work with computers, correct? Computer science.
Yes, yes.
So I wonder how this applies. So I'm going to step away from that for a second. What I have found is every once in a while, I'm convinced that the only branch of mathematics or the only branch of science today that still operates in essentially in a deterministic worldview is neuroscience. Because every once in a while I get this thing where it tries to show free will is completely a myth. And there's this whole way of doing these kinds of things. And I think the other place where I see hints of it is when people try to do like a philosophy of computer science. And part of it's because we're trying to map how does the human brain work as we can map it onto scientific language and all the rest. Do you feel like in the realm of computer science there's a deterministic interest? Or is that just a foreign term?
Okay. Writing programs and running them on a computer usually is deterministic, but even there, practical realities of distributed computing, where you have multiple computers working together, has automatically thrown us into an undeterministic world. Because the sequence of actions interacting, we cannot accurately predict what the timings are and all that. So in that sense, even computer science, even programming, which on a single computer could be deterministic, as soon as it encounters the external world, like I/O devices, when you're writing data to a disk, the speed of the disk transfer is, again, unknown, right? It's not accurate. So again, it becomes undeterministic at that level, but at a very practical level. But more theoretically, though, the logic of programming has been confronted by Gödel also, right? You cannot prove everything. Turing defined the halting problem. Right. We cannot determine whether a program will stop or not stop. It's just not possible, okay? So the openness of it, I think, has become part of computing culture from the very beginning. It's not deterministic thinking anymore, no.
Well, the reason I ask that is because it seems as though I wonder if the kind of theoretic old school notion that the program is deterministic, or at least could be within a single computer. Like I wonder if that is part of why that it, to whatever degree, if neuroscientists are thinking of the brain as being a very complicated computer, is that where some of that deterministic is coming back in, and will they eventually catch up with computer science when the computer scientists say, that's not really how this works anymore? I wonder if maybe that'll change. But I laugh every time I see there's one, I think they've done a couple different times where it's like they ask someone to both raise there's like a spinning dot, and they ask them to raise their finger or raise their hand at a moment, and they also ask them to pay attention to where is the dot when you made the decision to raise your hand. And what they find is the spike in the brain waves happens however many milliseconds before they recollect it. And I always just laugh because I don't know enough about neuroscience to know if this is the case or not, but it always feels to me like they're using entirely too blunt of an instrument to try to figure this out. But I don't know that. That's just my vibe. That's how I feel about it. And I'm sure somebody who knows a lot more than I do on that topic could tell me why I'm completely wrong. But that's how I feel when I read that.
I wonder if there isn't a fifth dimension implied here. So the nature of the verb, for me, again, it's back to the word intention, to say, when Jesus says, lo, I am with you always to the end of the age, there's time implied there, but the nature of the intention brings in the dimension of the personal that is intentional. And so to say, people are asking about AI, I saw somebody the other day ask AI, give me what this theologian would say to give praise and glory to God. And so it did this beautiful, thing. And the preacher said, that is not worship. That's just a machine. And I thought, you asked the original intention of a person who's written books to draw on that and give what they would say, give praise and glory to God. So it's as though they're just erasing intention out. And so to say that even with Alexa, when I talk to her, my intention to give her a command is what it is that gets her to do what it is that I want to do. So it's not as though intention is absent in that connection. It's just that the word mechanical here comes in. My intention works through that machine to turn on lights or whatever I want. But to say that there is a dimension of the personal in theological science that is another dimension that one has to investigate and that our logic has to include the intention of God to really understand God. Otherwise, will have reduced our language will have reduced God to something that becomes deterministic and objective and misses, in a sense, the point, maybe the personal point, that intention is the fifth dimension that the personal uniquely brings in, that makes things not just things and at a point in time or anything like that.
Marty, can I interject there too?
Yes.
This may be a good additional thought for your personal, for what you're writing.
Yeah.
So often, see, I took a class at our local community college regarding psychology. Okay, this was just a basic psychology class.
Yeah.
And, their focus is to find out, why do people do things they do?
Yep.
Well, the one dimension that the biblical witness gives us, which is, I think, absolute essential to our understanding of why we do things the way we do, is that when it says in the biblical witness, and the Spirit witnesses with our spirit.
Yes.
So psychology knows nothing about the human spirit.
Yeah.
This is not the Spirit of God. This is the spirit of man that is put into him. It's a spiritual, it's a pneumatic term,
Yeah.
but it's completely belonging to humankind.
Yeah.
And
in the
this
history of psychology,
this
they
is
begin with machines and then move to animals, which are both missing what you're saying. They can only see
exactly.
the human as an animal, not as a person missing this dimension. So I totally agree with you.
Yes, this is, I mean, it's totally non-existent.
And
I brought
it's
that
missing
up
too
to my
much.
teacher, and it was very interesting, to hear the response, because he acknowledged, in a way, yeah, that's so true. It's
Yeah.
something that's totally ignored.
And this is where John McMurray's work does provide language and a sense of the development of the person as person, not merely the self as agent, as merely that animal type being, but that we are who we are because of our intentional life that is nurtured in us by God, by the humans who surround us. And to miss that is just to miss too much. It misses the dimension of the personal. So
So
good.
Torrance has a concern that the ontologic not be damaged. That's at
Yeah.
the end of the sentence there. In such a way that the ontologic is damaged, if the essential forms of our thought are such, our statements, that's right at the end of what we were talking about.
This is the distinction we were talking about earlier, where Young suggested that we focus especially on when Torrance says formal logic, referring to the logic of our statements. The ontologic would be the logic that's inherent in the being of God. So he's trying to say, so we need to be aware enough of, we need to be able to operate in the kind of linguistic ways of being, which I think he tries to get at in his 3 levels that he talks about various places, so that we can speak in such a way that we are not distorting what really is the case.
Yes.
The reality of God in that case.
Right.
The
Yes.
ontologic of God.
Right.
The onto-relation of God, even. And I love that doxological you've got there on page 3 there.
So it's supposed to be doxological.
I know, but
I think I'm trying to say, I was trying to say that so like for example, it says "Wow, Newton." It's supposed to be "While Newton brought physics." Man,
I thought you just
wow, Newton brought.
appreciate.
Wow, Newton.
I thought you just wanted to emphasize the work of Newton.
Let me tell you a story. When I was first a pastor, it was before my kids were born. We had a family, a couple in our church invited us over for supper, and so we were walking. It was a small town. We were walking over there, and the husband and the couple was sitting on a front porch swing, and he has this little boy standing on the side next to him as he kind of doing the thing. And we're walking around the corner. We hear the little boy yelling something out. And we get closer. I said, "What was he yelling?" And he said, "Oh, I see God. I see God," because he saw me in church and all the rest. And I said, "That's amazing. People usually have no problems telling the difference between me and God." And this form is one of those things. So I have left my ego and pretensions at the door forever ago when it comes to all this stuff.
Okay. So just to pick up that statement, though, I mean, Newton
Sure.
here, often we hear Torrance dismissing Newton in a sense, but to say Newton was providing a form of logic, was part of a process of discovery that we need. So we need to have to hold attention of the value of those who have formed the process of bringing language, logic, but we can't get stuck in it. But we need to keep dwelling in the mystery of the reality of what is and allow that reality to keep unveiling, showing us what is there in a Confucian kind of way. Is that a fair thing?
Mm. So we're talking about this idea. He says here, like quantum physics and biology, theology lacks the particular kind of precision that's demanded in the field of classical physics and its corresponding logic. And rightly so, for to cast the statements of any of these sciences into the limited mold of classical formalizations could only lead to inaccuracy and imprecision. And he goes on from there, but it's that key idea that quantum physics shows us. Newton was a genius. I don't want to minimize his contribution by any means, but he was still dealing with physics at a point where almost everything he had to say was at least intuitively okay. I mean, he's working out the details. He's showing us how it all works out. But it's the famous apple, right? So what the insight that he's trying to show us is the same force that causes the apple to drop is the same one that keeps the moon going around the Earth. And that's a stretch for some people, especially if they haven't been taught that way. But this idea of impact and momenta and all these things, like people are like, oh yeah, I get that. I just he's just trying to make an order to it. With quantum stuff, we're talking about stuff for which we don't experience anything in our world that looks like quanta. And in the same way, so what that means and even just like the something I know a little better is the kind of the progression of how we've understood the notion of an atom. First it's just like a chunk, a hunk of something, that's just solid. And then of course we go, well, hang on a second. It turns out that we can tell a difference between there's charges, there's all the rest. And then we keep doing these experiments to try to get at what's going on. And we keep finding out these things. And one of the things that's interesting is that our current understanding of the atom is far less intuitive. I like the Bohr model of the atom, where you have a tightly packed nucleus and you have clearly defined orbits. It's nice. I get it. It feels like the solar system. It feels right. Unfortunately, it's not actually true. And the thing is, we would never. Why in the world would we ever give up such a beautiful, model of something for something that's so complicated and weird and unsatisfying? Well, the only reason to do it is because we've come to the conclusion that this is a better depiction of it. Yeah. And in the same way, what I think Torrance is trying to tell us here that's helpful is that, that's always been the case. We've always been dealing with that in theology. We've always been dealing with a reality that does not actually map to what we know in our everyday life. And so whereas before you used to have people on the outside, tease Christians about it, going, oh my goodness, you just believe anything. And now they're going, and now almost, if they didn't have that history, we might be able to say, what do you mean an atom? It's so small that you can't see it, but it's got a structure and it's got a positive, like why would you, that doesn't make sense. Well, that's fine, except the fact that we keep investigating, we keep learning, and we find that things are different than we would have assumed, which actually means, and we've gotten to the point now where it's almost like the least intuitive model that actually fits the facts is almost preferable because it shows us that we're not just reading our own order into things. That's probably an exaggeration.
Yeah. Jeremy Bigby again quotes Wittgenstein, we had a picture in our head that held us captive. And so your image of the atom being a particular way that held us captive from seeing it other ways. And Einstein was breaking pictures in the head about the nature of how light and gravity and all these things work. And the picture holds us captive. And so in some ways, Torrance is opening up the idea of the picture of God in some semblance of invisibility becomes non-existence for many people, but saying in the hearing that we move from the picture to something that opens up another access to reality. So it's this access to reality that katafuzen, we have to learn a different way than what we've been taught about the pictures that we're given in school and everything. You know, the pictures in the books are what feel like reality. And I haven't seen it. It's all a picture that holds us captive.
So what? So because you say that, this is a logo that's based on the Bohr model of the atom. This is for the American Association of Atheists, and it's hilarious to me because the American Atheists, because they have as their model, you know, their whole point is we're going to go where the evidence leads, no matter what, and we're going to be skeptical and all the rest. And they keep as their logo an outdated model of the atom. It is hilarious and ironic to the extreme.
I love
And
that.
We change our minds when we get contrary facts. We won't change our logo. That stays forever.
And then, if I understand it, of course, I am not a physicist or scientific expert at all. But hearing of the example that observing some of these atoms in experiments actually changes the way that the atoms follow their path is, so mysterious.
So right.
Yeah. I mean, and that's I remember, like, well, how would you know that it changed? And it's fascinating because I've been convinced. There's been a couple of explanations of like the double slit experiment that make it intuitively clear. Like, oh, now I can see why it might change. So even that, even when you grasp that, it still makes it like. So how do you deal with a reality that does that? Like, how do you bring that to some kind of sense? And knowing that you have limitations on what you actually can say. But again, like all that's really done is that's done once again what Torrance does so well, which is remind us that we Christians have been doing this for a long time, or at least we should have been doing it for a long time, and we're not actually people often say, oh, he's talking to scientists, and he is talking to scientists, but it always has in the back saying, really, the scientists are just reminding us of what we should already know, and that is every once in a while, in fact, or all the time, in fact, reality outstrips our language's capacity, and so we have to always have this sense of humility before what we're studying, and so it's you're right. What do you do? Again, we've used this example. The light is a particle and a wave. Particles that we're observing, they change what they do depending whether we're watching them or not. And you got scientists who, at least at one point in history, kind of threw up their hands and said, "What do you do with that?" And the answer is you keep trying to figure something out. And the only problem is, given that reality, you're always going to have some level where someone on the outside who doesn't know what they're talking about is going to come along and say, "Well, that's ridiculous. How can you believe something like that?"
One picture that holds them captive.
Yeah, you have a lump of uranium. Sorry, I'll stop there.
One lesson I gather from this, though, is we need to be cautious that we don't put quantum mechanics and relativity on such a high pedestal that we base our theological understanding using them as an analogical or whatever, because who knows, in 500 years they may be replaced with something deeper, and we don't want our theology to be captured by them the way 17th, 18th century theology was captured by the Newtonian worldview. And today's theology uses the computational model. And your statement earlier about trying to understand the human mind as a computer, to me, that's kind of dangerous as well. Even though the computer is a complex entity that we now have, artificially the most complex thing we're building, nevertheless, the human brain may be something completely different, inexplicable compared to the computer as a model. So, that's
thank you for teeing this up, because scientific realism is a fascinating topic, and one of the things that I learned a lot from McGrath when he talked about it, but I think McGrath is still a little bit too optimistic about kind of the mainstream of scientific realism today. I think that's where I would find them to disagree with him, because he'll talk about like the number one best reason to believe in realism is because all the scientists are basically realists and it works. Sure, but the number one reason why you should be a skeptic about that kind of realism is because Hilary Putnam has what was called the disastrous or the pessimistic meta-induction, which basically was every other theory we've ever had has turned out to not be right. Why do we think the ones we have today are right. Now, the reason why it's significant is because now what Torrance has been doing this whole time, but just throughout his whole writings, is he is advocating for a kind of realism that says it's not about the reality of our statements. It's about the reality of what we're investigating. And so it's one of those things where, it's certain that Einstein looked at things differently than Newton possibly could have. There's no way that Newton could have seen it the same way. There's no way that Newton could have seen things the way we see them now. And yet we're still investigating the same stuff in a way. I appreciate we're looking at a different level, etc. But the point is, a robust realism of the kind that Torrance is talking about is the point is not, is our word Adam, as I understand it today, accurate? The point is there that thing out there that we're investigating and continuing to learn from? And yeah, we're going to find out that doesn't look like what we thought it did. And we're going to have different terms, and we're going to distinguish things differently. We're going to talk about particles and not just atoms, because atom is supposed to be the word means that it can't be broken up. Well, we know that that's not true. Our atoms are not atoms. And the point, though, is that, so much of the talk about realism, especially with the inference of the best solution, all the rest, it's almost trying to calcify our theory today. And Torrance, 500 years from now, we might have a better term than homoousion. We might have a better framework than homoousion. Until we have it, we're not going to get rid of it, but we sure might in 500 years. And we would be foolish to think that somehow this word has captured the reality of the gospel. Now, we still need to be talking about Jesus, and we still need to be talking, from that point of view. And obviously, that would be a massive shift in the church to introduce anything new like that. But yeah, it's that idea of we are seeing a deeply robust realism in theological science that is not necessarily what everybody who goes by the name of realist today, or in the 80s and 90s when it was a hot topic, means by that term.
So I wonder about your Freudian slip at the bottom of your page 3. He is concerned not simply to show the impossibility of art theological system.
Our theological system.
I know, but I think the question that what you're just describing is the art of a science that's willing to keep developing. And so the
gracious,
certainty, well, it struck me, what does an art theological system look like? And it is the art of allowing a growing dynamic where our language keeps artistically at some level reflecting, describing the nature of what's going on. And that is the certainty of the uncertainty that you've been describing, that we let art not be a dismissal, but it is actually the aliveness of our formal expressions to continue to grow with the nature of reality, so that the word art becomes an appropriate term for it. So we just have to switch the word impossibility to the certainty of art theological systems.
See, it's like Jesus' parable. There's all the trappings of looking like I'm making these easier to understand, but I'm actually making it harder.
So anyway, I find
you're forcing us to think.
There you go.
When I saw that word,
this guy can't write. So what in the world was he trying to say?
I was thinking, what is he saying here? And I had to think deeper.
Oh, but the problem is, it's just I don't articulate well enough for my voice to text.
I'm actually looking at titling my 7-volume series on relational theology, "The Science and Art of Relational Theology," to say it is in the Torrancean sense, science, and in the Bigby sense, it always requires an art that is open to the dynamics of what it means to engage reality, to maintain the relational. So you need deep, thorough investigation with a lively, creative engagement that allows us to live in it as persons. So anyway, I value the two words being held together.
I mean, there's definitely the creative component, right? That
Yep.
as we encounter the failure of our old system, we have to come up with something new in order to more faithfully reflect the discoveries that we have. So there is definitely that, and I guess that would be called art. So yeah.
Yes. I'm comfortable calling it art and continuing to work on the language of what art means that keeps it with the dynamic that I hear him having an undertone as he goes through the chapter. He's leading in that kind of direction, I think. So on your page 4, you have one statement at the top that's the page 273, tries to illustrate what he's getting at by both speaking of a mathematical example and a theological one, uses the parable of the sower. You seemed somewhat not fully satisfied that he was able to bring math and the parable together. Do you want to just comment on that?
Well, I don't think that's quite what I was trying to get at. I was thinking it's
Okay.
unlikely. So there's two parables in Mark 4, and so I was trying to clarify which one I think he's talking about.
Okay.
But I'm suggesting he's using the mathematical example as an a fortiori argument, which is a how much more, so like in Hebrews, there's a lot of that where it's like, if this is how things used to be under the old covenant, if this is what we did, this is how we listened to God's messengers, how much more should we listen to God's son?
Okay.
So we're saying that even mathematics requires, because what does it say? If we take the simple arithmetical statement like 2 times 2 equals 4, it is not easy to explain, even though we regard its significance as obvious. Like, we all know we know what 2 times 2 equals 4 means. But the question is, if you actually want to break down exactly what is happening here, it's not easy to do. He says we have to use word language to say what the word symbols 2, 4, times, and equals means. And at the same time, we try to apply it to the real world by demonstrating it as we do, for example, with children with 2 sets of 2 apples. And honestly, 2 times 2 is going to be harder to explain than 2 times 3, for example. Because at least if you have 2 different things, you can kind of show how, it's commutative. But he says it is impossible to teach children without using at least 2 levels. But it's also true if we want to make it clear and precise, even for those who well understand what 2 times 2 equals 4 means, we have to use word language. So the point that I was trying to make here is it seems like he's trying to say, look, if even mathematics, the most abstract of abstract things, arithmetic, this is a completely self-contained world, like nothing in the world changes it or anything or modifies it, even that cannot really actually consistently live in a world that is only abstract. At some point, it has to still come back into this world. So if even mathematics, that thrives on abstraction cannot really exist in a totally abstract world, how much more is it the case, that theology needs to come into this world? So I was saying that it defends this multiple level of approach to biblical interpretation, because like if someone were to say, well, hang on a second, I think part of what he's doing here is to say, someone might say, well, hang on, mathematics is our paradigm case of clear, precise thinking. So theology has to look like mathematics, arithmetic even. And I think he's trying to say, look, even if that's true, even if that's, I think he wants to say it's not true, but even if it is true, it is already more dynamic than you're giving credit for. You are creating a false abstract notion of what mathematics is. So it's defending the this multiple level approach, which might be objected to by skeptics who want to naively point out contradictions, and it also reminds of the limits of strict logic. I do have a side thing where I do not think that Jesus' parables are obvious at all, by the way. I think they're obvious when they're paired with their interpretation. I don't think that if somebody came along, or maybe at this point here, I think that if someone came along and heard, the story is just a farmer goes out and starts spreading out seed, and some of it lands here, and some of it lands there, and some of it lands there. End of story. People go home. I don't know for sure. I mean, they could come with any number of interpretations for that. I don't think they would have. I think absolutely that the casual observer, casual hearer, would absolutely not have come up with the same interpretation that Jesus gives. Anyway, let's see.
So the word interpretation then becomes kind of the point of the chapter title, the formal logic that is used in theological thinking. The words have to have an interpretation, or the form of the logic is not been made usable for theological thinking. And Jesus' interpretation provides that for us. And so there's, the Bardian Christological starting point. We have to understand who Jesus is, or what he says, reveal to us the nature of parable and his words. The Father and I are one. Well, what does he mean by that? We have to start with what he might mean and not our mathematical equations.
I know we're running out of time here. I want to talk about where I get to do them here, because I just find that fascinating.
Let's do that, because I'm trying to get to page 5 and we're getting close to the end.
Yeah.
Talk about that.
But he's talking about the teaching of Jesus and Mark's teaching about the teaching of Jesus. And so I think what's fascinating about that is, again, he's trying to say that actually this really isn't different than what we're doing in science. So this is me speculating. It says whenever we often think we experience things in physics that directly, but it isn't so. Now we do in the real world. We experience mass in the real world, uninterpreted. We experience our own mass, we experience other mass on us. But when we measure mass, we are not measuring the mass. We are measuring the distortion or deformity of springs for that kind of thing. We are measuring a device that we have put in place to be a proxy. Because and the reason why it's interesting. All right, so I'll get to here. So this is important because we want to distinguish between the teachings of Jesus and Mark's teaching of the teaching of Jesus. We want to distinguish between them, but we can't separate them as if we had access to the former except through the latter. So what that means is like, so for example, oh no, that's going to be a whole different can of worms. But that's the idea. Like, so on the one hand, someone who's a skeptic could say, well, you don't really have access to the teachings of Jesus. You only have the teachings as they are interpreted to you from these various people. And it's like, yep, I appreciate that Mark is not Jesus. And if we only have access to Jesus through Mark, then we have to deal with that. But at the same time, we really do have access to Jesus. But the reason why, but again, since it only makes as much sense. Sorry, hang on. The question might be raised is, does this inextricability mean we can never know anything about actual teaching of Jesus? But it only necessarily makes as much sense as saying, can we really say anything about mass when our actual experience is observing readings on a scale? So one of the things that Duham does in this fascinating article, everyone should read Physical Theory and Experiment. It's just a marvelous thing. But he says, so he basically says the general trajectory we have is to say, hey, theory, you stay at the doors of the laboratory. We're going to go in here and do our experiment, and you stay at the door. You don't get to influence this. You don't have a role in this. We will tell you when we're done with our experiment, and then you can go to work. But he says, at one point, it is impossible to leave outside the laboratory door the theory we wish to test. For without theory, it's impossible to regulate a single instrument or interpret a single reading. There are things that you have to rely on to function. If again anything we do has mass, we have to trust. Using what was it, Hooke's law? Is that the one with springs? I think it's. But we assume that it's right. We don't question that in this moment. Now we can have a different conversation where we can question a different reliability. But the moment we use a spring scale, we are taking Hooke's law as gospel truth. It is absolutely reliable. We are not questioning it. If someone comes along and questions our experiment, there are certain kinds of objections we'll take. We'll say, "Are you sure you did this right? Are you sure you did that right?" If someone says, "Well, your whole experiment might not work because I don't believe that Hooke's law is valid," they're going to go, "Only serious objections, please." Because for the purposes of this, we are assuming that Hooke's law is valid. I just think it's fascinating because it's like, we tell us about Jesus, but systematically exclude all the gospel accounts. I don't know what you want. Where else are you going to get it?
That's the search for the historical Jesus that won't look at the Bible, right?
Right. And it assumes that they're unreliable. Now, I appreciate that you can't just assume that they are reliable, but that's the point. Is any information we're going to get about Jesus is going to have to come to us through somebody who saw him, because he didn't write anything, and he didn't leave a voice recording or anything like that. But again, also with everything historical, we have the same problem. If it's a problem for knowing Jesus, it's got to be a problem for everything else too.
Well, it's
Travis, on that note,
go ahead.
If it's okay, Marty.
Yeah, go ahead.
I understand, that we have 4 gospels. We've got 3 that basically harmonize. I put that in quotes because
Sure.
They don't really harmonize. I think what they do is they give us 3 different witness accounts, and you actually have to juxtapose them. Mm-hmm. So, meaning side by side or on top of each other. And the one thing that I learned from juxtaposing is, where Jesus says, well, if I, by the finger of God, cast out demons, and then in the context in another gospel, it says, and if I, by the Holy Spirit, cast out demons. So this juxtaposing of the witness accounts just gives more information. And all of a sudden, this figurative language, finger of God, means the Holy Spirit.
I think Torrance used the expression of a stereoscope, and one of the things. So Elmer would always talk about a magic eye, because I think that was hot when he was a PhD student. But I love the stereoscope in particular because I think it's so intuitive to explain to people. Like we all close one eye and then close the other eye and all the rest. And the fascinating part is your 2 eyes are different. What the images that your 2 eyes make are different at every single point. They're different at every single point. They're at different angles. It's not the same. And we would never say that the difference, if someone were to say to me, now hang on a second, Travis, your left eye sees this, but your right eye sees this, and there is contradictions between them. The appropriate response to say it is precisely the differences in what they see that actually allow us to see what's really there. That we can actually see something more clearly because of the two angles that are happening simultaneously. And I find it such a beautiful way of dealing with such a naive criticism of, well, if these, well, which did he really say? Was it the finger of God or was it the Holy Spirit? Now, I think,
Mark, that's such a beautiful observation. I'm thinking of the Sistine Chapel, of course, where you've got the finger of God touching Adam, and I did not know that until now that could also be interpreted as the Spirit of God in that creation.
I didn't know that either. That was just marvelous to learn.
Wow. Yeah.
In my 4th volume of Calvart's Church Dogmatics, the beginning of it, I'm doing a magic eye of the finger of John the Baptist from the picture of the head. So you have to get it in 3D to see somebody who's doing a 3D, and it's illustrating Bart's prophet, priest, and king, the 3 images of the person of Christ. So it's a very heavily laden 3D dimensional kind of thing with implications. But just to say, all of these images help us to capture this sense of what is seen and what is beyond what is seen without being trained to interpret it in a way appropriate to the nature of what it is that's going on.
That's cool.
So is there anything last thing you'd like to say in the concluding bits at the bottom of your page on page 5, Travis, before we wrap up, just to make sure you've wrapped this chapter well, the final paragraph, et cetera, et cetera?
Well, man, I did a remark. I think it is interesting. I said here that interestingly, Torrance does not use the summary, this big picture thing, to reason once again with Christ. I can't remember why I was thinking about that. So no, nothing's come to my mind. I'm sure I thought about something at the time.
Good. Okay, so chapter 5 in one sentence, all the sections. The one thing we should take away from chapter 5 is Torrance wants us to understand.
Torrance wants to understand that logic starts from reality. God, and then created reality, and then it's a function of our statements, not the other way around.
Okay.
Good. I think that's the relentless point he's making.
Good.
Through all the sections.
Well, I want people to walk away. There are simple points that he wants to make, and they're throughout all of Torrance's logic, and so to just make it clear here is quite helpful. So once again, Travis, thank you for a triple 3D engagement with chapter 5 and bringing such life and spark and other readings that really help things become clear. So we are getting last week's. There have been 59 views of last week's session. So I mean, people are watching these. So the fact that there are 5 of us here.
Oh, hey,
I saw many people who are watching. So
I got a message on Facebook from somebody. I don't know if anybody else did. And they were asking if I knew anybody. Hang on, where was it? Let's see. Someone's in the PCA. Do you have any contacts in New England who are fans of T.F. Torrance and N.T. Wright? And I said, unfortunately, I don't have any connections in New England of any kind. So
well, there you go.
So if anybody's watching this after the fact, send me an email and let me know.
There you go. There you go.
So
good. Well, again, I will be signing off, and we'll see you all again in it'll be June before I get back. So enjoy the rest of May, come what may, and we'll continue with chapter 6 with the amazing Carrie Magruder. So blessings.
Have a wonderful, Marty. Have a wonderful vacation.
Yeah,
I'm sure it will be amazing.
Yeah, no doubt.
Yeah, enjoy.
I'm not going as many places as you are, but I'm going to spend about 2 weeks in Scotland. So we'll be
okay.
Oh,
well, I wish I was going there
too.
too.
2 weeks. That's
dress warmly.
I don't know if you. I have a friend, Richard McIntosh, who's been here a couple of times. He lives in Berlin, so I'm going to see him in Berlin, and we're going to see Emmanuel Bush's son, who's been helping me connect with Eberhard Bush as well. So some kind of fun things along the way.
Very cool.
Yes.
Yeah, have a Berliner Weisse for me.
Okay. Take care. Bye bye.